Welcome to the Transform My Dance Studio podcast, the only podcast for dance studio owners, where each week we bring you business growth strategies to help you increase your profits, impact the lives of more students, while ensuring you get back some time to have a little life outside of the studio. It's time for you to become the go-to studio in your area. Now, here's your host, founder of the Dance Studio Owners Association, Clint Salter.
Hey Dance Studio owners, it's Clint. Welcome to this week's episode of the Transform My Dance Studio podcast. I'm currently in Halifax after spending a great week in Soho, exploring the city, working on some great new projects that we've got coming up. Plus, I got to see Book of Mormon again, the musical, for the second time. One of my favorite, such a clever show. I randomly, 2 hours before the show, jumped on their website and I got a ticket for the front row. It was insane. I had such a great time. And I also got to see Aladdin again randomly 2 hours before the show. It had just opened its third preview. Logged on, there was one ticket left, and I ended up sitting in the row with all the American creatives, including Casey Nichols, who is the choreographer and director, such a fantastic, clever guy, also choreographer of Book of Mormon. So had a nice little chat to him, and it's such a great show. So if you haven't seen Aladdin, definitely go and take the children to it. Book of Mormon, don't take the children to that one. But both really clever, amazing shows. So glad to be in Halifax this week. I'm presenting at the Baby Ballet Annual Conference on Friday and Saturday. Cannot wait to speak to these franchisees, owners. You've probably heard of Baby Ballet. Claire O'Connor started it about 10 years ago, has over 70 franchisees teaching her preschool ballet programs throughout the UK. So super stoked to be here. Today's episode is about a question that's come up quite frequently in the association, and it's something that I've never spoken about outside of the group. And so I thought it would be really beneficial for us to talk about it. And that's all about negotiating a lease for your studio. Now, I'm not a lawyer. This isn't legal advice. These are just tips that I've had, that I've implemented, that I've passed on, that I've seen from other studio owners that I've worked with. Because when I was 17 and a half, I had to go through negotiating a commercial lease for the dance studio that I had with my friend Kelly Lee. And it's an interesting process, and since then I've had to do it again for some different clients, and the landscape is always changing, but there are fundamentals that I see, studio owners getting tripped up all the time, and they rush in and they sign the lease, and then 6 months, 12 months down the track they go, what? CPI? What's CPI? What's a CPI increase? What? You don't change the light bulbs? What? I have to pay for heating. And so we get, things come up that we're not aware of, but we've signed kind of our lives away. And so I wanted to touch on just a couple of those things today. Now, firstly is looking for a location. So when we're looking for a location to run our studio, maybe we are transitioning out of being a hobby studio in a community hall or a recreational centre, or operating out of a couple of community centres and wanting to bring it into one place. I want you to make sure that you just don't take the first thing because it looks exciting, it's your own space, and you think it's a bit too expensive and it's going to be a bit of a stretch, but you might be able to do it and there won't be anything else, and now is the perfect time. You really want to make sure that you crunch those numbers first to understand what you are getting into. Before we go through anything to do with the lease, you really need to say, okay, where am I at in my business financially at the moment? Where am I at? If the business doesn't grow over the next 6 months, can I afford this space? And when I say afford, it means, can I obviously pay the bills? Can I pay my teachers? Can I pay myself? Can I still eat? Will I have to live on tins of tuna or ramen noodles? What is it going to mean if I take over this space and don't grow my business? Because that is a potential reality, that your business might not grow for 6 months. Hopefully not, but we don't want to move into a new space saying, well, we're going to get 100 new students if you didn't get 100 new students the year before, right? So it's just getting that clarity. And then you want to put projections in place, and depending on the current size of your studio, you'll have like two lots of projections. What if we increased our student base by 10%? What does that look like? What does 20% look like? What happened if we increased the average classes that our current students did by just one extra class a week, and maybe 60% of people do one extra class a week? What does that look like? How does that affect our bottom line? So get really clear on the numbers before you jump in, because I know, right? You go to a building, and we do this, you go to a building and it looks amazing, and you're like, we're in. But you haven't kind of gone and done the research and crunched the numbers to say, can we be in and survive and then thrive and not be stressed, broke? Because what happens then, we get sick and our business doesn't do very well. So you want to crunch the numbers. Now, when you find a place that you love, let's talk about negotiating that lease. Now, the first thing is you're going to need to be paying monthly rent. Now, depending on where you are in the world, that price is going to be different. But what you want to look for is a fixed rate would be a dream, right? And that's saying, let's say you sign a lease for 3 years with maybe a 1 year to a 3 year option on the place, which means you can then sign on for another, 1 to 3 years, is that the rent doesn't change. It's fixed. You pay the same amount of rent. That's a dream. Do landlords want to do that? No, of course not. What they want to do is annually, they want what's called a CPI, Consumer Price Index increase. Okay, so they want to increase your rent every year, and I'm okay with that. But what I want you to ensure that you look at doing in your lease is getting a fixed rate for the first 2 to 3 years. So no CPI increase, so no increase in rent for 2 to 3 years. And then after that time, you'd be happy with an increase, but I would put a percentage on that. You don't want it to go over a certain amount, because where I see studio owners get kind of stuck is where there's nothing in their lease about what that CPI increase can go up to, and then all of a sudden they're paying an extra it depends, $500, $1,000, $5,000 a month. It's depending on the space, but a lot more money than you ever anticipated, because they see you're doing well, you're making money, you're not going to leave that space, you're going to cough up that money. That's going to hurt your bottom line. So make sure that if you can't get the fixed rate, which is unlikely, that you negotiate no CPI increase for 2 to 3 years. And don't take the first offer that you get. Don't look at a lease and go, well, that's all I can get. You've got to negotiate. And if you are not comfortable negotiating, maybe there's a friend of yours that is a good negotiator, or get a lawyer. You're going to need to get a lawyer involved anyway to look over the lease, but get a lawyer involved to negotiate for you. They will save you so much money. They will be worth their fee. So really look at that. Another thing that you want to look at is the fit out. So obviously running a dance studio, let's say you get a warehouse, you're going to need to fit out that space. So you're going to need bars, maybe mirrors, sprung flooring. It might be an open space at the moment. You might want to partition it into 2 studios. You might want a waiting room. You might want to build an office. And so when it comes to fit out, who's going to pay for that fit out? Generally, as a studio owner, it will be you. Maybe they pay for the structural fit out. So they might put some walls up for you. You say, look, I'll do the bars and the mirrors and the flooring, but I want a wall here and a wall here, and I want to build an office here, and I want this, and I want you guys to do that. Okay, so get really clear on who is doing which part of the fit out. Also, if you are doing a fit out, let's say it's going to take you maybe 4 or 6 weeks to fit out your studio, I would negotiate that period is rent free. Right? So let's say your rent starts on the 1st of the month, and let's say it's going to take you 4 weeks. Let's say the 1st of the month, the month prior, is say we're going to start, renovating them, but we don't want to pay rent for that month because we're not making money. Where you've got us in this space, we're here, we're going to start paying you rent from whenever, but we want that as a rent-free period. Okay, cool. So that's one of the things with fit out. The other thing you've got to be aware of in the contract is if and when you leave that space, do you have to turn it back to the way that it was? Okay, so a lot of agreements will say, as soon as you leave the space, you've got to make it exactly the way it was, which means ripping up the floors, taking down the mirrors, doing the bars, taking down, the walls that have been built, fixing the office space or whatever it is. So, look to see if you can negotiate on that, and maybe that's you might go halves in making it the way that it was. You may be able to leave it, take down certain parts, like leave the walls and the things that they might have done, and you take the flooring, the bars and the mirrors off. Look at those details. It's super, super important. Let's talk about termination and exit clauses, because what will happen, generally it's in favor of the landlord, and it'll say, the landlord can terminate the contract straight away if you're in breach of it. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that they actually should, and get this written into your contract, send you a notice of breaching the contract. Right? So they send you a notice of breaching the contract, and let's say you want, I would say 14 to 21 days for you to remedy that breach that you've done. And if you fix it up in that time, well, then they can't terminate the contract. It's a really good clause to have, actually, and not many people have that specific clause. So I would get that sorted as soon as possible. So if you breach the contract, generally the landlord can terminate and kick you out. But what you want to say is, before you do that, we need a notice of breaching the contract, and you're going to allow us 14 or 21 days to remedy that breach. You get it sorted, whatever it was. Sometimes you don't even know that you've done it because contracts are so in depth. You get it sorted, and then you can move on. When it comes to the building, you might want to make some improvements, right? And a lot of leases will say, you can make, you can't make improvements unless you give, the landlord X amount of days in writing and blah, blah, blah. And that's fine. You want to just ensure that what is in the contract, that you can make improvements to the space, with consent, with permission from the landlord, but consent will not unreasonably be withheld or delayed. So you might say, in writing that you submit an improvement, and you then get a response within 7 working days. So they're the things that we want to put into this structure, into this contract, so that then if you want an improvement, if something's happened, you can move forward really quickly on that. Now, sometimes it gets a bit tricky with leases of who pays for what? Is it you that is paying for plumbing problems or the light bulbs that go out? If you're in a warehouse, the light bulbs are very expensive. I remember from our days, they're more expensive now. So you want to work out who's paying for those things, and I would list those items so that it is super clear and transparent. So everyone has clarity around who is responsible for what. The other thing that I would do, if you're paying for utilities, if you're paying for, heating or air conditioning or whatever it might be, that you get examples from previous bills, right? Because every setup is different. Every space uses different amounts of energy. And so you might be used to, if you're coming from a little recreational center or something where you don't have to pay for that, and you're moving into a big space, to aircon a space or to heat a space, it can cost a lot of money. So get some bills from, the previous years of the tenants that have been there, so you get a really good understanding of, kind of what, estimates of what you're up for when it comes to those things. The other thing on that is also look at common areas, right? So if there's a problem in the car park that's right outside your door, or there's something wrong with the roof or whatever it is, who is paying for those repairs? Okay, make sure it's really clear. Generally, it's the landlord, but again, sometimes it might not be. And if they've written into their contract that you're responsible for it and you've missed it, well, then you're up for a lot of additional fees. one that I see that gets kind of skipped often is the permitted use of the premise. So how are you going to use the premise? What I would strongly suggest is you don't have in the contract, and the landlords sometimes want this, is that you will only use the premise for dance classes. Because, for instance, what happens if you want to run birthday parties, which I know is a great revenue stream for so many of you? It's something that we teach, a lot of. And, if in the contract says you can only do dance classes, that's going to be a little bit hard for you then to do birthday parties. The other thing is around subleasing. So one of my favorite revenue streams, in those times where your studio doesn't have people in it, is to lease out the space to a meeting group, to a corporate group, to a yoga person, to a Pilates person to come in and take classes, so you're making income while the studio is not being used. And a lot of leases might say you cannot sublease, so you want to make sure that you've got a clause in there that you are able to sublease, that you can use it for other purposes. And maybe you have a group of purposes, and then anything outside of that, you need permission from the landlord. I'd prefer not to have that at all, but again, it's all about negotiating here on what is going to work. The term of the lease. Okay, and this is going to be dependent. Sometimes I'll say, I want you to sign a 5-year lease. I'm a big fan of a 3-year lease with an option on it, but it's got to feel what's comfortable for you. Now, if you're signing a 5-year lease, that's a long time. Make sure you get a rent-free period. So a rent-free period might be 3 to 6 months of free rent if you're going to be there for that amount of time. Even if you were there for 3 years, this is what we did, even if you're there for 3 years and maybe that building's been abandoned, been vacant for a while, I would say to them, hey, you know what? We want the first month is when we're going to be moving in, and we're not going to be operating, so we're not making income. So I definitely want that free. And then I want an additional 3 months of rent free. So we won't start paying rent until, that 5th month. And so negotiate with them, say 6 months and then get them down to 3 if that's what you really want. This is the power of negotiation. Okay, so I think they are the main things I wanted to run you through. So, the rent, negotiating that rate, fixed rate, the CPI increase, the termination clause, looking at the fit out, who pays for it, how do you do it, who's responsible for all the different parts of the building and outside the building, the common areas, the improvements that you wanted to make, the permitted use of your premise. These are all the things that you need to look at when you are negotiating your lease for your studio, because it is such an exciting time. And if you're about to make the leap and the jump, I wish you all the very best. I remember when we did it, and it was one of the happiest, scariest times of my life as a studio owner. If you've got any questions, jump over to the website, click on podcasts and post your questions below. Be happy to answer any additional questions. And if you're one of our members inside the Dance Studio Owners Association, I'll be there having conversations this week about this very topic to make sure all of you are moving forward and doing the best thing by you, not your landlords, when it comes to signing that lease and negotiating the lease. It has to be a win-win for everyone, and so often it's a win for the landlord and not so much for the studio owner, because we don't really know what to look for. So I hope today's episode of Transform My Dance Studio was helpful. Can't wait to see you guys again next week. Talk to you soon. Bye for now.
Thank you for joining us today. For all the resource links from the show and to receive access to our free dance studio growth training, make sure you visit transformmydancestudio.com.